Hi, today I'm going to tell you how I invited my wife to a restaurant for a date and when I got there I found out the terrible truth about her other life. The restaurant was crowded, its ambience alive with soft murmurs of conversation and the clinking of glassware. Yet, none of it registered. Not the warmth of the candlelight or the richness of the aroma wafting from the freshly baked bread rolls on our table. My attention was fixed entirely on Beth. Her laughter seemed different tonight, too free, too sparkling. She leaned slightly toward the waiter, a young man with sharp cheekbones and an easy smile. She touched her necklace as she spoke, her fingers lingering in a way I hadn't seen in years. I forced a smile, picking up my glass of water. The waiter's attention wasn't on me, it never had been. From the moment he approached our table, his focus was singular, my wife. I'd chosen this restaurant for our 10th anniversary dinner. A quiet celebration to commemorate a decade of shared dreams, struggles, and triumphs. But the flicker of doubt had already taken root in my chest. I couldn't ignore the way her eyes danced when they looked at him. Not at me. "Mark, you've barely touched your steak," Beth said, her voice pulling me back. Her smile seemed genuine enough, but there was something behind it, something that set my teeth on edge. "I'm just not as hungry as I thought," I replied. My voice was steady, but my mind raced. The waiter returned, setting down dessert menus with a flourish that seemed exaggerated. He grinned at Beth, who met his gaze with an intensity that didn't feel like my Beth. She laughed again, a light, airy sound, as though the three of us were part of a private joke. It wasn't a joke, I understood. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, sparing me a glance at last. I wanted to say no. I wanted to demand an explanation for the warmth in his tone when he addressed her, the way his hand lingered slightly as he set the menu down. But instead, I nodded, forcing my face into a mask of polite indifference. As he left, I turned to Beth. Her eyes followed him for just a moment too long. When she met my gaze, there was something guarded in her expression. I didn't know then that it was guilt, but I felt the shadow of it creep into the space between us. "Did you want to try the crème brûlée?" she asked, her tone breezy. "Not tonight," I said, my appetite now entirely gone. The evening ended in strained silence, Beth chattering about plans for the weekend while I nodded absently. But the doubt had taken root, and as I drove us home, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. Beth was no longer mine. Or perhaps, she had already decided to stop being mine long before tonight. It wasn't until later that night, lying awake in bed, that I allowed myself to piece together what had happened. Beth's laughter echoed in my mind, an unfamiliar tune, foreign in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I turned to glance at her, curled away from me, her breathing steady and even. She slept peacefully, while I wrestled with a gnawing sense of betrayal. What had been so captivating about that waiter? Was it his youth? His effortless charm? Or was it something I couldn't see, something only Beth could feel? The next morning, she hummed a light tune while tidying the kitchen. As she moved to clear the counter, a serving bowl perched on the edge caught my attention. It was one of her favorites, cream-colored with delicate blue filigree patterns along its rim. I watched her fingers linger on it as she wiped the surface around it. I stood there, leaning against the doorframe, pretending to read the newspaper but carefully observing her. The bowl slipped slightly under her hand. For a moment, she froze, her expression unreadable, then reached to steady it. She looked over her shoulder at me and smiled, the glow of the restaurant evening still in her eyes. "You're quiet this morning," she said, her voice casual. "Just tired," I replied, not lifting my gaze. I could hear the deliberate evenness in my tone. As she turned back to her task, the bowl teetered again, this time dangerously close to the edge. I stepped forward instinctively, but before either of us could react, gravity claimed it. The bowl shattered on the tile floor with a sharp, decisive crash. "Oh!" Beth gasped, crouching to gather the pieces. "It slipped. I don't know how I let that happen." Her words were rushed, her cheeks flushed. The sound of the shattering bowl seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. "It's just a bowl," I said softly, though the weight of her reaction struck me as odd. "We'll get another." "No, it's not just a bowl," she muttered, more to herself than to me. She paused for a moment, staring at the fragments before scooping them into her hands. "I loved this one." She set the pieces aside carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them in the trash. Then, as if collecting herself, she straightened and smoothed her apron, her smile returning, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's fine," she said brightly. "I'll find a replacement." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had cracked open, not just the bowl, but the illusion of stability between us. The way she handled the shards, the flicker of unease in her expression, all of it seemed like more than just the loss of a piece of pottery. I helped her clean up the remnants, my mind replaying the sound of the bowl's breaking. It was as if the fragile veneer of our marriage had splintered along with it. And as I swept the last of the dust into the pan, I made a quiet promise to myself, I would uncover the truth. Even if it broke me. The following evening, we returned to the same restaurant. Beth had suggested it, her tone light and breezy, as if the night before had been nothing more than a pleasant memory. I agreed without hesitation, though unease stirred in my chest. If she was hiding something, I needed to see it in the same setting where the cracks had first appeared. As we were seated, I couldn't help but notice her subtle effort in dressing up, her hair meticulously styled, her lipstick a shade more daring than usual. She smiled at me across the table, but the warmth felt rehearsed, like a stage actor repeating lines for the umpteenth time. "Let's make tonight better than the last," she said, raising her glass of wine in a toast. "To us," I replied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. It didn't take long for the waiter to appear. It was him again. His polished charm and easy smile seemed amplified as he greeted us. He stood closer than necessary, his presence like a shadow over the table. Beth's reaction was immediate, a brightness in her eyes that didn't belong to me. "And for the lady?" he asked after taking my order. "I'll have the salmon," she said, her voice lilting with a softness I hadn't heard in years. As he walked away, I tightened my grip on my glass, the stem cool and fragile beneath my fingers. "Funny we got the same waiter," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Beth shrugged, her fingers playing with the edge of her napkin. "It's a small place, Mark. Don't read into it." Read into it? That was exactly what I was doing. Every glance, every pause, every flicker of hesitation between them told a story she didn't think I could see. When the food arrived, I focused on eating, though every bite felt heavy, tasteless. Beth chatted easily, her words filling the silences, but I barely listened. My eyes drifted to her glass of wine, half empty, its deep crimson reflecting the flickering candlelight. The moment came as she reached for it mid-laugh. Her fingers grazed the base, and in her haste, she miscalculated. The glass wobbled, tipping toward the table's edge. I reached out instinctively, but it was too late. The glass shattered against the floor, spilling wine like blood across the pristine white tile. "Oh no!" Beth exclaimed, crouching to assess the damage. Her cheeks were flushed, not with embarrassment, but something else. Her composure cracked, her movements hurried and awkward. The waiter appeared almost instantly, kneeling to help. His hand brushed hers as he gathered the broken glass, and she looked at him, her lips parting as if to speak but saying nothing. It was fleeting, barely a second, but it felt like an eternity. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The world around me blurred, the clinking of cutlery and hum of conversation fading to nothing. "It's fine, ma'am," the waiter assured her. "Happens all the time." "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying an intimacy that made my chest tighten. As he walked away with the fragments, Beth returned to her seat, her smile now strained. "I don't know what's wrong with me tonight," she said, laughing nervously. But I did. Something was wrong. And as I stared at the faint stain left by the wine on the floor, I knew the time for suspicion was over. The truth was there, somewhere in the shattered glass and stolen glances. I just had to figure out how to confront it. A week passed, and the tension between Beth and me simmered like a pot on the verge of boiling over. I couldn't shake the memory of the shattered glass, her hurried movements, or the fleeting glance exchanged with the waiter. Each detail played over in my mind, feeding a storm of suspicion that left me restless. Beth suggested dinner at the restaurant again. I agreed, though my unease deepened. This wasn't coincidence anymore, this was choice. She was drawing us back to the scene, as if testing how far she could go without breaking entirely. The evening began much like the last. Beth was radiant, her smile lighting up the room, but there was an undercurrent to her laughter, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. We were seated by a new hostess this time, but to no surprise, the same waiter appeared to take our order. He approached with his trademark charm, but as his gaze fell on Beth, it lingered, just as it had before. A polite man would have spoken equally to both of us, but he barely acknowledged me. I clenched my jaw, my grip on the edge of the table tightening. Beth ordered first, her voice carrying a flirtatious lilt. My stomach churned as I caught the faintest hint of a smile on the waiter's lips. When the food arrived, I tried to focus on my meal, pushing back the urge to confront her here, in the open, where everyone could see. But as the waiter passed our table later, something unexpected happened. A busboy carrying a towering stack of plates stepped into his path. Neither saw the other until it was too late. The collision was loud and chaotic, the clatter of dishes shattering against the tiled floor sending heads turning across the restaurant. The waiter stumbled back, his polished demeanor replaced with genuine surprise. But it wasn't him who fell. Beth, seated near the edge of the table, had been leaning to adjust her shoe. The busboy's momentum sent him careening into her chair, knocking her sideways. She hit the floor with a gasp, her expression a mixture of shock and embarrassment as she tried to right herself. "Beth!" I exclaimed, rushing around the table to help her. My hand reached hers, but before I could pull her up, the waiter was there. He crouched down beside her, his hand brushing hers as he helped her to her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle and full of concern. Beth nodded, her cheeks flushed. "I'm fine. Just startled." The busboy stammered an apology, but neither she nor the waiter paid him much attention. Their focus was solely on each other, and my presence felt invisible in that moment. As she straightened, brushing off her dress, she laughed softly. "What a night." The waiter smiled. "It's never boring around here, is it?" I watched them, my chest tight with a fury I barely contained. The intimacy of their interaction was undeniable now, like an unspoken language between them. I had been a fool to doubt what I already knew deep down. Beth sat back down, composing herself quickly. She waved off the incident with a practiced grace, but her eyes carried a spark of something that set my teeth on edge. Was it exhilaration? A secret thrill? As the waiter walked away, I returned to my seat, my movements slow and deliberate. "You're sure you're all right?" I asked, my voice calm but clipped. "Of course," she replied lightly, dabbing at her cheek with a napkin. "It was just an accident." Her words felt hollow, a thin veil over something much darker. The cracks were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came tumbling out. And when it did, I would be ready. That night, the silence between us felt louder than ever. The rhythmic hum of the car engine couldn't drown out the tension. Beth stared out the window, her fingers drumming lightly on her lap. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, each mile we passed weighing heavier on my chest. When we reached home, she stepped out quickly, her movements brisk, as though escaping the unsaid words lingering between us. I followed her into the house, shutting the door with deliberate slowness. "Beth," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. She paused in the hallway, her hand on the banister. "Yes?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. I walked closer, my eyes fixed on her. Are you going to tell me what's really going on, or should I? Her brows knit together, and she crossed her arms defensively. What are you talking about, Mark? I'm talking about you and the waiter, I said bluntly. I see the way you look at him. The way he looks at you. Beth scoffed, shaking her head. You're being ridiculous. He's just doing his job. You're reading too much into this. Am I? I stepped closer, my voice rising slightly. Because it seems like more than that. The way you light up when he's around, the way you can't stop smiling at him. It's like I'm not even there. She turned away, heading up the stairs. I don't have time for this, she muttered. Don't walk away from me. I snapped, my voice echoing through the house. She froze mid-step but didn't turn around. What do you want me to say, Mark? She asked, her voice soft but laced with frustration. That I enjoy the attention. That it feels nice to be noticed. I stared at her back, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Why isn't my attention enough for you? I asked, my tone quieter now, almost pleading. She turned slowly, her face a mix of guilt and defiance. It's not that you're not enough. It's just, different. He doesn't know me like you do. He doesn't see me as just a wife or a mother. For once, I feel like someone sees me. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. You're my wife, I said, my voice trembling with restrained anger. I see you every day. I've loved you through everything, through your best and worst. And you're telling me some stranger sees you better than I do? Beth opened her mouth to respond but stopped, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but then she straightened, her jaw tightening. I don't want to fight about this, Mark, she said quietly. Can we just go to bed? I watched her ascend the stairs, each step a reminder of the growing distance between us. She didn't deny my accusations outright, but she didn't confirm them either. Her silence spoke volumes. I stayed downstairs for hours, staring at the darkened room. My love for Beth was still there, raw and aching, but it was tainted now. I couldn't unsee the cracks in our foundation, the ones she had tried so hard to ignore. The confrontation had given me no answers, only more questions. And as I sat in the quiet of our home, I realized one thing with certainty: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following day, Beth was unusually cheerful, humming as she prepared breakfast. It was as though the confrontation from the night before had never happened. She moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, her smile bright and unwavering. But to me, it felt forced, a mask over something she didn't want me to see. I couldn't pretend anymore. The truth had become a weight I could no longer carry alone. As Beth left the room, her phone buzzed on the counter. She had left it unlocked, an oversight, or maybe a sign of her confidence that I wouldn't look. My hand hesitated above it. Was this who I had become? A man so consumed by suspicion that I'd invade her privacy? But the thought of not knowing was unbearable. I picked it up and scanned the messages. Most were innocuous, but one thread stood out. It was a series of texts from an unknown number. Last night was electric. Can't wait to see you again. Dinner tomorrow? Same place. My stomach turned as I scrolled further, my hands trembling. There was no explicit mention of the waiter, but the context was clear. She was meeting someone. Again. Mark? Her voice behind me made me jump. I fumbled with the phone, placing it back on the counter, but it was too late. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me, her expression hardening. What are you doing with my phone? She demanded. I couldn't hold back anymore. Who is he, Beth? Her lips parted as if to deny it, but then she stopped. Her shoulders sagged slightly, her gaze dropping to the floor. It's not what you think, she said softly. What I think, I said, my voice sharp, is that you're meeting someone behind my back. So tell me, Beth. Who is he? She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. It's nothing. Just a few messages. I needed someone to talk to. To talk to? I laughed bitterly. Is that what you call sneaking off to see another man? Is that why you've been dragging me back to that restaurant, so you could parade me around while planning your next rendezvous? You're blowing this out of proportion, she snapped, her voice rising. It's not like I've done anything wrong. Nothing wrong. I stepped closer, my chest tight with anger. You've been lying to me, Beth. Hiding things. Do you even hear yourself? Her face twisted in frustration. I just needed something, Mark. Something I wasn't getting here. And what exactly is that? Excitement? Attention? My voice cracked as I spoke. Do you even care what this is doing to me? To us? For a moment, her expression softened, and I thought I saw a flicker of remorse. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the same guarded look she had worn for weeks. I didn't plan for this to happen, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said. And you're still doing it. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the kitchen, the silence between us deeper than ever. That night, I made a decision. If Beth wouldn't give me the truth, I would find it myself. Whatever was happening, I wouldn't let it destroy me without a fight. The day after our heated confrontation, Beth's demeanor shifted. She avoided my gaze, her movements around the house deliberate yet tense. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. My mind churned as I pieced together the fragments of our unraveling relationship. I needed answers, and this time, I wouldn't wait for her to give them. I left the house earlier than usual, under the guise of running errands, but in truth, I parked down the street from the restaurant. If Beth was meeting someone tonight, I intended to be there. The hours crawled by as I sat in my car, rehearsing what I might say or do if my suspicions proved true. By the time dusk fell, the glow of the restaurant sign flickered to life, casting long shadows over the cobblestones. At 7 on the dot, Beth arrived. My breath hitched as I watched her step out of her car, dressed in a fitted black dress that clung to her figure in a way that turned heads. She paused for a moment, smoothing her hair, before walking toward the restaurant entrance. My stomach churned. This was no casual dinner. I followed at a distance, slipping inside moments after her. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile, but I waved her off, scanning the room for Beth. I spotted her at a secluded corner table, her back to me. And there he was, the waiter, seated across from her. His demeanor was different without the guise of professional courtesy. He leaned forward, his smile easy, his hand brushing hers on the table. My blood boiled as I watched the intimacy of their gestures, the way they shared quiet laughter like conspirators in some secret plan. I positioned myself near a pillar, half hidden but with a clear view of their table. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. At one point, she leaned in, her hand resting briefly on his arm. He responded with a smirk, and I could see her cheeks flush even from where I stood. I waited for the moment I would reveal myself, though each passing second felt like an eternity. I wanted to burst in, to demand answers, but I forced myself to stay still. I needed to understand how far this betrayal went before confronting her. The tension in my chest built until I felt like I might explode. Then, Beth did something I hadn't anticipated. She stood, smoothing her dress, and he followed suit. They walked together toward the back of the restaurant, disappearing through a door marked private. Panic and fury warred within me. This wasn't just a flirtation over dinner. Whatever they were doing, it was happening now, behind closed doors. I clenched my fists, fighting the impulse to charge after them. Instead, I approached the hostess, forcing a tight smile. Excuse me, I said. Do you know where that door leads? Oh, that's the staff area, she replied, her tone polite. Storage, the break room, things like that. It's not for customers. Thank you, I said, my voice clipped. I waited until her attention shifted elsewhere, then moved toward the door. Pushing it open just enough to slip inside, I found myself in a narrow hallway. Voices drifted from the far end, muffled but unmistakably theirs. I crept closer, my heart pounding like a drum. Can't keep doing this, I heard Beth say, her tone conflicted. Why not? He replied, his voice smooth and coaxing. You deserve to be happy. I do, she admitted. But this, it's too risky. Mark suspects something. He's been watching me like a hawk. And what if he finds out, the waiter said, his tone dismissive. What's he going to do? Leave you? You've said yourself, he'd never walk away from the kids. Her silence was damning. My pulse thundered as I stepped closer, every fiber of my being screaming to stop this. Beth, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. They both froze, their heads snapping toward me. Her face drained of color, and the waiter's smirk faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Mark, what are you doing here? Beth stammered, taking a step back. What am I doing here? I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. What are you doing here? With him? The waiter raised his hands, his charm evaporating. Look, man, it's not what it looks like. Don't insult me, I snapped. My eyes locked onto Beth. Is this what you've been sneaking off to do? Lying to my face while you run off with him? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her silence was the only confirmation I needed. I turned to the waiter, my fists clenched at my sides. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Before I do something we'll both regret. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, slipping past me and disappearing down the hallway. I turned back to Beth, who stood rooted in place, tears welling in her eyes. Mark, she began, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I felt invisible. I needed to feel wanted again. Do you even hear yourself? I asked, my voice rising. You destroyed everything we built for what? A fling with a waiter? Tears spilled down her cheeks. It wasn't like that. I never stopped loving you. Don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't say you love me. You don't destroy someone you love. She reached for me, but I stepped back. Mark, please. We can fix this. No, I said, my voice firm. You can fix this. Alone. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway. The weight of her betrayal pressed heavily on my chest, but as I stepped into the night, I felt a strange clarity. The illusion was shattered, and now, I could finally see the truth. There was no going back.